Hello again, and welcome to the Castle Old Skull Hawk Moor project, where we explore the deepest roots of Dungeons & Dragons in search of greater understanding and forgotten details that we can use to move forward into the future of old school-inspired game design. The Hawk Moor project celebrates the world of Greyhawk as created by Gary Gygax, as well as the world of Blackmoor as created by Dave Arneson and all of their gaming friends and co-creators. If you enjoy Hawk Moor and you want to keep me around on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Today, we are looking at Dave Arneson, creator of Blackmoor, and his innovative ideas which led to the creation of a game called Dungeons & Dragons. These are ideas that matter to all of us and resonate on through the decades. These ideas are at the core of our hobby. Gary Gygax refined them, but Dave Arneson originated them. Let's delve down and see what treasures we can find. Welcome, friends, to Hawk Moor. For today's episode, instead of my usual AI pieces of art crafted in Midjourney, I am celebrating one of my favorite human artists, William McCausland of Outland Arts. I do have a paid license to use all of this artwork as featured in this sequence. If you like what you see, let me know in the comments, and be sure to check out more Outland Arts offerings at the links shown below. Note that I am not directly affiliated. I just love his old school stuff, and I use it in my published Castle Old Skull books all the time. If you go adventuring over there, tell him that Old Skull sent you. That's me, Kent David Kelly, with kind regards. And now, welcome to Dave Arneson's Revolutionary Systems. In February of 1979, Dave Arneson brought a legal action against Gary Gygax and TSR with the formal complaint that he was being deprived of royalties on, among other things, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which TSR was marketing as a separate game with no purported authorship by Arneson. Only Gary's name was on the book covers, so Arneson, citing these as derivative works being offered in bad faith and misleading the public for the purposes of Arneson excluding enrichment of Gygax and TSR, wanted co-author credit, past royalties, and damages. He won an advantageous settlement, by the way, which is a long story in its own right. At one point in the interrogatory proceedings, around November-December 1980, Gary Gygax and team decided it would be a great idea to force Dave Arneson to precisely explain the exact ideas and concepts that he contributed to Dungeons & Dragons. Ideas that crept from the 1974 original game into future derivative works, such as the 1977 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual and the 1978 Player's Handbook. He was demanded to express these ideas in order to justify his receiving royalties on these products written by Gygax and TSR staff that did not have Arneson's direct authorship. This was actually a terrible legal idea because it gave Arneson a perfect platform to explain precisely what his revolutionary systems were that turned Dungeons & Dragons from a mere board game into a totally new form of gaming and imagination exploration entirely. Hereafter begins my personal summary of Arneson's formal answer, circa January 1981, to this interrogatory court question. System 1. Authorship via remote collaboration. This was not only a system, it is more of an approach to game design, but it becomes more and more of a system as we move into consideration of the game design future. Arneson and his legal team specified that the game Dungeons & Dragons was co-created over the course of 1973 by the plaintiff, Dave Arneson, and the prime defendant, Gary Gygax. This collaboration very rarely took place in person. Most often, perhaps even 99% of the time, it took place telephonically or through written correspondence. That last part, fortunately, leads us to a world where many of the letters and postcards documenting this crucial game design time period have survived into the present day. While old-school pen pals, such as Lovecraft and Howard, for example, often influenced one another's contemporaneous creative works over a long distance in the past, this was a high-profile 1970s example of a future world in which co-authors of equal standing would create inspirational works together without being in one another's day-to-day physical presence. System 2. Character creation. Building off of the Twin Cities Bronstein methodology, Arneson refined the concept of character creation as a player portal into the shared fantasy campaign world as run by the referee, or dungeon master. More specifically, Arneson's collaborative method, ability scores rolled by the referee at the time, and naming chosen by the player, led to a simple character template that exemplified a unique individual every time the dice were rolled. The ability scores were customized via choices made by the player. Further choices, such as race and class and equipment selection, ensured that the player identified directly with a single character as the active imaginary persona within the game. Instead of role-playing Napoleon, for example, players could create and role-play Robilar, or Tensor, or Tarek, and begin making their own stories through a new alter ego persona that they could directly and intensely identify with. System 3. Character progression. Characters did not have static roles in Arneson's conception of the game. In Gygax's earlier chainmail game, there were heroes and superheroes, but there was no life path for a hero to become a superhero over time and adventures. There was even a direct sequence of wizard tiers, with seer, magician, warlock, sorcerer, and wizard as the hierarchy, and this probably inspired Arneson's intuitive leap toward thinking about the idea of character progression. But Arneson was the one who defined the nature of that progression. Over time and through play, characters could perceive the environment, be moved by player decision, gain knowledge, act in a race or class-defined manner, and increase in power over multiple sessions of gameplay in the same overarching narrative of the shared world. Characters could gain experience points, wealth, and treasures that offered further powers and wider choices. The ability to fly or sail in the world, for example, would invite completely new approaches to exploration of this world. Through such progression, the player becomes even more invested in their character, and the referee's world expands through additional player-driven requests and actions that necessitate the creation of new frontiers, monsters, treasures, and game mechanics. System 4. Codification of magic. In legends and fairy tales, magic is a nebulous answer to everything and every problem. Its application is arbitrary in accordance with the storyteller's needs and preferences in advancing a specific tale. Only rarely does Magic have rules, and very rarely do these rules carry over between stories in any comprehensible and rational fashion. Arneson created a system of magic via spells and magic items to directly simulate the effects and limitations of weapons, armor, wands, hexes, and blessings in the game world. He was partly inspired by Gary Gygax's chainmail in doing this. Instead of being arbitrary, these expressions of myth and fantasy had codified measurements of cause and effect, and simulationist degrees of success and failure. Through the codification of magic into a game, players could perform unpredictable imaginative actions in the game world in a manner that allowed the referee to adjudicate the results in accordance with random probabilities and expressed guidelines rather than arbitrary binary decisions of just succeed and fail. System 5. The Dungeon. Borrowing from Robert E. Howard's Scarlet Citadel, Tolkien's Moria and Goblin Town, weird fiction, Arthurian lore, horror movies, and fairy tales, such as The Brothers Grimm, Arneson defined a unique subterranean setting that featured decision pathways as labyrinths, hazards in the form of tricks and treasures, and imaginary foes, monsters, and also non-player characters. This environment provided a way for the referee to offer player choice, to limit choice to a manageable series of major options, and also to challenge the players in resource management, with consideration being given to monster strength, adventurer strength, depleting light sources and ammunition, and the gradual accrual of hero wounds. Even more innovatively, the dungeon is presented in a series of vertical levels. Each level features more challenging monsters and more valuable commensurate rewards. By inviting player risk-taking and strategy and rewarding the same, while also offering punishments that the player has already intuitively acknowledged are both approachable and reasonable, the dungeon is the manifestation of player progression offered in a controlled fashion by the game master. The story of the campaign naturally progresses in parallel to the adventurer's new descents further into the dungeon's deep. System 6. The Dungeon Master. Evolving from the wargaming referee role and having gone through new evolutions via the diplomacy game, the Bronstein sessions, and Arneson's home-crafted historical simulations, the referee of Dungeons & Dragons, known as the Dungeon Master, serves as the game's forerunner and storyteller. Through the Dungeon Master, limited information, defined by what the characters can see and hear through their own perspectives, is disseminated in limited form to the players. The players then make free-form choices resulting from this information in consideration of their personal goals, skills, and strategies. The referee considers these attempted actions and notes if the game's rules and codified systems and rulings, which are intuitive, newly developed workarounds to rules that don't exist, are needed to determine an action's potential for success. A decision is made, modulated by dice and probabilities. The action results are defined in terms of perhaps partial success and partial failure, and the play feedback begins anew, with the DM providing more limited information after this determination is made. While directly evolved from the wargaming referee role, none of this is intuitively obvious to a person who is trying to run a new form of game for many simultaneously participating players. The Dungeon Master role is the culmination of hundreds of choices, workarounds, attempted solutions, failed solutions, table play refinements, and instinctive decisions made in the heat of the moment, during many years of play. System 7. Monsters and Magic Items. In a manner similar to the codification of magic, many fantastical creatures and arcane relics from myth and fiction are brought into the game and streamlined into a series of numerically definable attributes. Monsters, for example, have speed, lethality, endurance, and special powers. Magic items, meanwhile, have values, intensities, powers, charges, drainage uses, and other limitations. In addition to the expected items, such as magic swords, crystal balls, rings of invisibility, and similar items, new treasures were also created through inspirations drawn from comic books, movies, stories, and television series. Further, even more items were created to address player requests or to limit unexpected bursts in character power, and also to entice characters into adventurous journeys in and beneath the game world as players sought new treasures for their characters. The distillation of magic, combat, and exploration mechanics into numbers and systems allows for the creation of general templates that can be applied to any desired new idea, so that any emergent concept can be added to the game, then play-tested, and then further refined for purposes of balance, fun, and overall fairness. This approach allows for the development of a potentially infinite array of new monsters, too. System 8. Race, Class, and Experience Level. Characters in the game are described and their abilities defined in what Arneson termed three-dimensional development. These three factors are simply race, meaning ancestry, class, meaning profession, and level, meaning degree of power or experience. While these elements have become so pervasive that they now seem glaringly obvious to everyone, at the time, 1973, these were very odd delineations. Compare with Gygax's chainmail game, for example, where military units are defined by their armor, weapons, and occasionally a culture or nationality. It is not until we get into the fantasy supplement of Chainmail that Gary Gygax's unit types become more nebulous, and even there we find that species, race, and degree of prowess are largely non-delineated beyond a unified descriptor. There are, for example, hobbits, sprites, dwarves, elves, heroes, superheroes, wizards, and so forth, but they aren't very much differentiated between themselves. Gygax almost got there with his distinction of sub-wizards as the sorcerers, warlocks, magicians, and seers, but it seems that it was Arneson who specifically identified the race, class, and level distinctions as being needed to further detail every possible type of fantasy unit. System 9. Wilderness Exploration. While this does not seem nearly as revolutionary as Arneson's dungeon concept, the wilderness is actually a very interesting piece of the game. Its demonstrated role, outside of the 1979 to 1981 court record, becomes much more apparent when we consider Arneson's newsletters, play reports, and the stories of game participants in his Blackmoor campaign. In a war game, there is the map. Each game typically demonstrates one battle or a series of battles, and in the interest of simulation, the map is made to conform to the actual historical terrain. Sometimes there would be games where referees and players were invited to make their own maps. And in Diplomacy, for example, although the default Europe map was widely published, fans spent thousands of hours designing maps that resonated with history, their imagination, or places like Tolkien's Middle-earth. But in Arneson's Blackmoor game, the map's contents were largely unknown to the players. There would be some defined map features, but more and smaller features and random encounters would be added as characters searched any unknown area. Randomly generated encounters would then lead to the placement of new lairs. And more tellingly, Arneson's game was not just a battle simulator. This was an explorable environment presentation, and players could decide whether they wanted to fight, explore, go off the edges of the map, or even found their own towns and castles in various places. Where the rules of a war game would strictly downplay or prohibit any actions beyond combat, Arneson's game encouraged breaking of the rules as a means toward expanding the entire campaign world's potential of opportunity. System 10. Wound Depletion Combat. While other games feature some of these elements, Arneson was the one who combined polyhedral many-sided dice, variable damage, individual unit damage tracking, and the gradual accrual of wounds eventually leading to death. Again, these concepts are now so obvious to us that they do not seem like innovations at all. But when they are put together, they create a high-stakes, risk-taking adventure simulation where players identify with a single character's health, accruing wounds, and ultimate survival or doom. War games were more about simulating as many men and machine units as possible. A single counter or game token might represent dozens of tanks or hundreds of men fighting in formation. Damage in such a system might be coarse or even binary with just destruction and no effect, or roughly simulating partial loss, morale, or unit degradation. Wounds to people-specific systems, however, were rare outside of the Bronstein games. Much of this was simply because detailed record-keeping caused large battle simulations to grind to a halt, and so things were abstracted at a larger level. But when a referee, the dungeon master, is willing and able to track all of these details for a few people, and the players are made to assist by each individually tracking their own character's hit points, the zoomed-in small scale of the simulation becomes much more immersive. It becomes action-reliant and story-driven. Taken together, we now have these 10 revolutionary systems that define Arneson's major contributions that turned Gary Gygax's writing and rules codifications into a vivid expression of endless horizons, which would become TSR's products of your imagination. Dave Arneson demonstrated the power of turning a referee into a game master who allowed any attempted player actions. Gary Gygax developed and published an expression of systems. Arneson tested and refined this and came up with many revolutionary new additions. Then Gary took the crucial steps of clarifying Arneson's innovations, revising them, bringing them more closely together, writing things down, publishing the game, and marketing it to like-minded players. Gary was the refiner, Arneson was largely the creator. But the truth is, these two men needed each other's strengths, or none of this was ever going to work. Neither of these proud men truly acknowledged the other's contributions at the time as being equally important, and this, in the end, is what all the fighting boiled down to, especially in court. It was all about forcing recognition of vital mutual contributions to the unity of the one game. This volatile mix created Dungeons & Dragons, and this tension ensured that the game would still stand as the fundamental gateway into a new form of gaming that is still expanding its horizons into the present day and well beyond. And there you are. That's a lot to consider. And these game design ideas certainly resonate throughout the decades and the years to come. Carry on the tradition of old school gaming with your loved ones, family, and friends. Be sure to pass on our old school role-playing hobby to those younger people that you love so that it doesn't die out as some fad owned by a heartless corporation. And I thank you for listening to Hawk and Moor. I hope you found that interesting, and I hope to see you again soon for our next adventure. Take care.